Well, hello, everybody. It's lovely to see you all here today. And I'm delighted to have been invited to moderate this afternoon even. Latest economic modelling from AXA UK and the Centre of Economic and Business Research shows that work-related stress and burnout is currently costing the UK economy £28 billion a year and resulting in 23.3 million sick days a year. Data from AXA's Mind Health study reveals that almost half, 47% of the country, are struggling or languishing, defined as an absence of positive well-being or in emotional distress. And in the past decade, resilience has become a hot topic. Challenges in our health, work, and relationships are inevitable. And it's now generally accepted that learning the skills to recover from adversity is one of the most important personal development journeys we can take. And as a career coach, I see overcoming problems and leaning into resilience is a really important factor in career well-being. And what about resilience in business? So when it comes to our global socio-economic outlook, McKinsey suggests you don't need a crystal ball to predict turbulent times ahead. Their survey in September 22 on economic conditions revealed that geopolitical tensions, inflation, and a gloomy global economic forecast are top of mind for CEOs. And in the face of this looming uncertainty, many leaders are thinking more than ever about building resilience. So Faith in Business theme suggests that resilience is God's unique gift. And today we're considering being productive working from rest. And the Bible puts rest at the center of the gospel, presenting rest as the reason why the gospel is good news. It shows that at the heart of God's offer of salvation in and through Jesus Christ is the offer of rest. Jesus tells us that rest is not for God's sake, as he has no need of anything, but for the sake of God's creation. Therefore, rest is not something we do passively. We are to reflect on God's decision to stop work after 6 days of creation, consider his handiwork, pronounce it all very good, and declare the seventh day holy. Ken Barnes and Rob Wright are going to show us that understanding these truths does indeed bring resilience, and that working from rest is God's way of being productive. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what they've got to say. Our first speaker is Reverend Dr. Kenneth J. Barnes, and he's the Mockler Phillips Professor of Workplace Theology and Business Ethics and Director of the Mockler Centre for Faith and Ethics in the Public Square at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Ken's main areas of research and teaching are the intersections of theology and economics and faith at work. His recent book projects include Light from the Dreaming Spires, Reflection on Ministry to Gen Y, and Redeeming Capitalism. Prior to his academic career, Ken spent many years as a senior international executive for several multi-billion-dollar companies doing business on 6 continents. In addition to his corporate work, Ken also has worked with SMEs and startups and continues to serve as company director and mentor to young executives. Then our second speaker is Rob Wright, and he is a resilience specialist who coaches, speaks, trains and writes about how we can become more resilient. He calls his business Giant, as our most overwhelming challenges don't defeat us because they're too big. They defeat us because they make us feel small. So he helps workers, workplaces, and communities to recover mentally and emotionally from their biggest setbacks and begin to feel bigger inside than life is outside again. And he helps underdogs on a mission to find the emotional and mental strength to go up against their biggest giants too. Rob has been a believer for around 40 years. He came to faith in London, his hometown. He now lives in Ipswich, worshipping at his local New Frontiers church. And I'm delighted now to hand over to Ken.
Thank you, Katie. That was a wonderful introduction, and probably I'm unworthy of all of it, but it's wonderful to be here. Great to have the Mockler Center and Faith and Business working together over this whole year, looking at this really important issue. And so I would say thank you for hosting us, and welcome to some of our folks from Gordon Conwell and the Mockler Center. who are joining us today. It's wonderful to come together. So what comes to mind when you hear the word Sabbath? For most people, you're going to think of this Judeo-Christian day of rest, or even the verb itself, rest. But actually, Sabbath means to cease. Now, why does that matter? Well, I would suggest to you it matters because Sabbath is more than just an injunction against manual labor or other forms of work. If you think about the biblical use of the word Sabbath, especially in the creation narratives, what God is doing is establishing a framework for all of our human activity as a reflection of his creation mandate. Autumn Mockler, who is a fellow of the Mockler Center and a professor of ethics here at Gordon Conwell, she puts it this way. She says, humans are spiritual creatures meant for Sabbath rest that reflects eternity as gathered time. Sabbath directs humans to participate in the disruption of time that is demanded by the monotony of work, particularly in a digital age. By practicing Sabbath, we participate in a posture of receiving rather than producing, consuming, or performing alone. Instead, we receive our primary identity as persons made in the divine image and likeness who are redeemed as children of God. So this broader understanding of Sabbath presents, I believe, a biblical construct of Sabbath as prism, through which we better understand the cosmic purpose of all human activity. Seen this way, Sabbath can become for us a faith-based practice that readies the heart and the mind and builds the resilience necessary to challenge cultural norms that are present in business and economics. So at the Mockler Center, we're working on this book together, bringing together scholars from Harvard and Australia and different places. And we're looking at 5 areas where we think this more comprehensive understanding of Sabbath can actually help believers build that resilience by reshaping their professional identity in accord with God's will and God's purpose for their lives. So the 5 areas that we're going to unpack for the next year, and I'm going to just give a brief overview today, is how it affects our values, which we call Sabbath as reprioritization, how it affects time, which we call Sabbath as resistance, how it affects our use of space, which we call Sabbath as reimagination, how it affects our relationship with other people, which we call Sabbath as renewal, and our faith, which we call Sabbath as redemption. So beginning with Sabbath as reprioritization, it begs the question, what is the purpose of business generally? Is it merely to create wealth, or is it something else? Is it possibly a temporal means to an eternal end? Is there something about being created in the image of God, who is the worker par excellence, that actually renders our work our worship, as is suggested in Colossians 3? And if so, to what divine purpose? Similarly, Sabbath as resistance asks whether in our desire for economic excellence, have we actually enslaved ourselves by voluntarily succumbing to the pressures of postmodern capitalism? Have we inadvertently offered our bodies and our lives as living sacrifices, not to God, as demanded by the scriptures in Romans 12, but actually to the cult of economic excess and devotion to mammon, which Jesus warns against in Matthew 6:24. And Sabbath as reimagination, that explores whether the ubiquitous intrusion of technology and the constant pressure to perform in ways that are ever more stressful, has that in fact conspired to deny us the God-given right to both personal and sacred spaces. This feeling of always being at work has blurred the lines between home and office, labor and leisure, and made it harder for us, I believe, to connect with God in cathedrals of both stone and nature. Sabbath as reimagination, it gives us permission to look beyond the mundane, pedestrian nature of brute materialism to the wondrous, awe-inspiring nature of the divine, to reclaim our rightful place in the cosmos, our oneness with the Creator, and the promise of eternal life in the very presence of God. And what about the nature of our business relationships? Are we to conform to the market's presumption of naked self-interest? Surely, for any person of goodwill, whether believer or non-believer, the purpose of work and economic activity must be more than self-aggrandizement and the accumulation of personal wealth. It must first and foremost be driven by a genuine concern for the common good and love of neighbor. Sabbath as renewal reaffirms all of God's covenants with his creation in general and with each other in particular, and presents us with a model that builds community on earth while anticipating the new heaven and the new earth to come in Revelation 21 and 22. And lastly, we're going to explore Sabbath as redemption. Sabbath as redemption warns us that in the modern world, pursuit of economic excellence has reduced almost every aspect of self-actualization to the relentless pursuit of self-gratification. A kind of neo-hedonistic cult has emerged that drives people to seek pleasure over purpose, matter over meaning, and stimulation over substance. It is a modern phenomenon, but there's nothing novel about it. In fact, it's existed for millennia. And no better example exists in the Bible than the life of King Solomon. The Bible teaches that Solomon was the greatest person of his day, the greatest king of riches and wisdom. He ruled over Israel's golden age, and he was universally praised as this great man of great faith and great wisdom and great wealth and great power and great prowess. And yet, the Bible tells us he died a bitter and broken man. And he describes his own accomplishments as merely chasing after wind. And in fact, soon after his death, everything he had built lay in rubble because God warned him. God warned him that if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees that I have given you, including observing the Sabbath, and go off and worship other gods, I will cut Israel off from the land and will reject the temple and reduce it to a heap of rubble. Well, Solomon did exactly that. He did chase after other gods. And in fact, the God he worshiped most, perhaps, was himself. Our own idolatry is one of our greatest pitfalls. Centuries later, Jesus asked a very interesting question. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? I think that's a question that every business person should ask themselves every day. And this is really the challenge of Sabbath as redemption. It begs the question, whom do you serve and to what end do you labor? For Jesus, one's priorities and motives are just as important as one's actions. And so Jesus famously said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Perhaps he said this to warn us that we must cease what we are doing on a regular basis and ask these very probing questions that I've just posed to you about values and time and space and relationship and faith. It just may be that Sabbath is less about resting from work and more about working from rest. That's our challenge. And I'm happy now to turn it over to Rob.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was ridiculously agitating and provoking. It's really interesting that this talk comes at this point in my own walk with God, because this whole idea of Sabbath is something that God has been speaking to me about, and Sabbath in a very specific way. And if it's okay with you, I'm just going to give you a window into what God's been doing with me, and let's see if it lands with you in some way as well. So let me take you back just a few weeks to a job that I was working on. I've got a client I've been working with in a number of areas. I'm a copywriter and a graphic designer, and I've been working with them for about 9 years now. And of late, I've been doing some resilience work as well. So I've got this portfolio career that includes resilience, and that's coaching and training and facilitation. And my client has a executive team that she works with, and over the last 3 years, they've grown rapidly, but they've shown some signs of growing pains, if you like, because of their rapid growth. And so she just wanted the opportunity for the team to get together, to reset, and my job was to facilitate a series of meetings over several weeks to help them to come to a point where they could get their team, about 130 odd staff, all on the same page, all rowing in the same direction. So I quite like my clients. I've learned over the years that my work works better if it's less transactional and much more relational. And so my investment with this client was I care about them. They actually matter to me. Their welfare matters to me. What emerged as the work was continuing, as I was working on how I was going to get this group of people, this team from A to B, was I was beginning to think more about how I was going to come across to these very learned. Each executive in this room is published and very accomplished in their field. And I was thinking much more about how my relationship with them was going to land, rather than how they were going to increase and improve in their own work and their own dynamics as a team. And by the time I'd spent many hours trying to make sure that I was going to give them the kind of experiences that they needed over the next few weeks and months, I started that morning thinking that I was unprepared and ill-prepared. I wasn't ready for the challenge. Now, as it was, I went into those the first session was 4 hours. As it was, our first session went really well. Client came back, said it was very helpful. Team members also said it was very helpful. But it left me with an uneasy feeling after that session. And I was wondering what on earth was going on for me. So very often, when I'm working with clients who are struggling with their resilience, typically what happens is that there's some kind of inciting incident. There's something that happens that introduces them to a dilemma. And this experience is typically strong. And this dilemma they have to ask themselves is, why am I so disrupted by this? Why am I so uneasy? Why am I so feeling such disquiet? So I called my business giant, because the inciting incidents that we face, they don't defeat us because they're too big. They defeat us because they make us feel small. So what was it about this whole process that was reducing me to this feeling like I needed to perform, I needed to produce, I needed to work really hard to make sure that my connection with my client was sustained, that I didn't lose face, that I didn't lose the opportunity to work with them again. And what I began to realize is that each of us, very typically, when we're facing challenges that are rather big, we have to come to a conclusion. We have to understand what exactly the problem is. And for me, the problem here was self-determination. What you might not know from my story is that I had a very strong episode that happened for me many years ago, and somebody didn't pay me tens of thousands of pounds, which resulted in me losing my equilibrium, losing my having challenges with the way that I approached my work and saw my work. And as a result of that, we lost our home. So very often when we go through very strong experiences, one of the things that leaves us with is a need for independence, a need for control. And what I was learning as a result of this episode, what was coming to light for me was this need for independence. That as a believer, I didn't have to suffer. And what I was learning was that I was trying to take that which I can only receive. And what's interesting about this whole conversation about Sabbath is that in Christ, God gives us a unique gift, the gift of rest, the gift of resting from our labors, the gift of being able to avoid the temptation to try to take that which we can only receive. And as Ken has so eloquently put it, this gift comes to us in the person of Christ. It comes to us in the person of, it comes to us in the good news of the gospel. We get to cease from our labors. We get to cease from our efforts because of this transcendent, glorious, majestic, beautiful, extraordinary gift of grace that we get to receive. So for me, this whole conversation is something I'm beginning to process even now over these last few weeks and months, that my work doesn't have to come out of this need to protect myself, to provide for myself, for self-actualization. For our basic needs, we need other people. We need others to support us in our evolution and our development as people, and for human flourishing. And one of the things that I've learned from this episode that I had with my client and the way that I was approaching my work was that relationships, my relationship with myself, my relationship with God, is fundamental to my performance. And one of the things that I've learned over the years with in my resilience work and working with high performing teams is that if we are able to have a transcendent view of work, the most high performing teams are always, or have in common, this overarching aim, this overarching vision, which takes them out from themselves into a transcendent view of work. This opportunity to collaborate, this opportunity to cooperate comes from our relationships, and the invitation that we have, I think, the invitation that I have, let's personalize it, shall we? The invitation that I have is to make sure that my connection with Christ, my Sabbath rest, my all in all, my all sufficient one, allows me to reset, to disconnect from this drive for independence and self-sufficiency, and allows me to reconnect to him for my purpose, and as Ken has put it, for my identity, so that I can rest in him and stop from this drive for self-actualization that robs me of my peace and of my joy. So I hope you'll find that helpful. Katie, have we got any questions, or where do you want to go next on this?
Thank you very much, both of you. So Ken and Rob both back here now. Any questions, please put anything in the chat. We have a comment here from Sarah, a transcendent view of work, not trying to take what you can only receive. So beautiful. Thank you, Rob. I'm sure that there will be questions for Ken on his wonderful theology of Sabbath rest and that opportunity to cease, and how we can then work from cease. And then obviously Rob and his very personal tale there. Thank you, Rob. Any questions in the chat? We had a comment before about resilience has been shown to be key to teenager mental health, and in the passage to adulthood. Perhaps resilience is simply maturity. I don't know what you'd have to say to that. Maybe Rob, you were smiling then.
Well, one of the things I try to underline for each of us, each of the people I'm working with, is that we are already resilient. We are incredibly resilient. We're the human narrative, the human story is that we are ridiculously resilient. The question really is, how resilient are we, and can we leverage that resilience in areas where we're feeling vulnerable, or we're feeling diminished and feeling small in some ways? And so I'm not sure that I would like to start with the idea that we're immature in some way if we're struggling with our resilience. My preference is that we have a strength-based approach to our personal development. So we're starting from a place of sufficiency rather than a place of deficiency. I think that's really, really important. And it means that we're actually going to be much, much more resilient when we're facing the challenges, if we're feeling that we're coming from a place of can do rather than have to or can't, if that makes any sense. So I'd much rather reframe that if I possibly can with my clients.
Thank you. Fiona, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I'd like to hear from both Kenneth and Rob. When you recognize that you are losing the plot in terms of this working from a place of rest, what is your first step? Or what is your first step in even recognizing that first step so that you know you need to stop and change something?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have found in my own life that my body tells me that things are out of whack. And I listen to my body. And when I realize that I'm feeling particularly stressed, the probability is because I think I'm the one who can fix everything. I think I'm the one in charge. And it gets back to this whole issue of self-idolatry. I lecture a lot on leadership, and I use a lot of examples from the business world of CEOs who have crashed and burned. And hubris is almost always what gets them. And hubris is nothing more than self-aggrandizement, self-idolatry. You actually think that you are God. I think it was Nietzsche who said, we all think we're little gods who go to the bathroom, right? But the fact of the matter is none of us are God. Only God is God. And so listening to our own body, our own stress signals is a good way for us to remember that we've got to refocus and depend on God. And let me just lastly say, the person I work for today, the president of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, is the most resilient CEO I have ever worked with. And I've worked with some amazing CEOs. But his resilience comes from his deep-seated faith. And I just think it's a tremendous lesson for all of us. Rob, what would you say?
Yeah, I echo that, Ken. I'm convinced that the next great move of God is going to be helping individuals, particularly his children, to get much more in touch with how we're feeling.
Thank you. I'm going to stop you there because I think we've got so much to discuss, and I'm being asked to go to breakout rooms. So there are some lovely questions in the chat you can discuss in the rooms. We've also got a kind of overarching question, which I know Stephen's going to put in the chat. How might we bring the unique gift of Sabbath from Sunday to our normal working week to increase our resilience and the resilience of others?